Welcome to Trade and Tariff Tuesdays. We're back with another edition of Avalara's webinar series discussing the Trump administration's tariffs and their impact on trade compliance. We started this weekly series back in February. If this is your first time, welcome. If you've joined us before, welcome back. Just a friendly reminder that Avalara cannot provide legal or tax advice. On your screen is our safe harbor policy. Please take a moment to review. We're recording today's event, so you'll receive the recording later today. The console you're looking at can be customized. Feel free to move or resize the windows. The additional resources section contains a lot of great related resources, including the slide deck. There are several ways to engage with the presenters and attendees. First, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Ask a Question box. We'll save time at the end for Q&A, and we may also sprinkle them in during this presentation. You may also submit troubleshooting questions in that box. Second, you can join our attendee chat. Click the icon at the bottom of your screen with the two chat bubbles, and the attendee chat will appear. We encourage you to introduce yourself, network, and discuss today's topic. Third, you can react to the presentation by clicking on the emoji icon and reacting. Last, today's webinar continues on with a 45-minute format so that we have a little bit more time for Q&A. And since this session is less than an hour and intended to be interactive and responsive, it is not eligible for CPE credit. Avalara's customer conference Crush is going on tour. And I think I mentioned last week that our own Shane will be there in person. So you can meet him there, ask him any questions on trade and tariffs. And I believe he may mention it later, but there are going to be some sessions that deal with trade and tariff. All right, let's meet today's presenters from Avalara. We have Craig Reed, General Manager of Cross Border, Shane Bogdan, Director of Sales for Cross Border, Patrick Frith, Senior Director of Growth for Cross Border, and George Trantis, Senior Director of Global Marketplaces, helping with Q&A in the background. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Craig to get us started.
Well, hello, everyone. Good to be back. It's been a couple of weeks for me. We've been out traveling the world, as last in Australia, where guess what they're talking about? Tariffs. So it is a worldwide phenomenon. We are going to talk about the latest news in trade compliance, what's going on today. We'll talk about some of the implications to your business, how you can take action with Avalara, and we'll do, as Regina mentioned, we'll do some Q&A. We'll try to pepper that in if there's questions that we see that are relevant to what we're talking about. So, gentlemen, let's dive into it. I think first thing we have is a poll question. We like to kick things off with a poll question. So this time around, the Court of International Trade in May made a ruling on a U.S. trade measure that they said exceeded any authority granted to the president. Which one was that? So we'll give you a minute to answer that question. It's interesting, guys, that like this has become household information now. All these esoteric section numbers and abbreviations and acronyms for all of these what used to be esoteric trade lingo is now sort of the lingua franca of trade, right? Or of households talking about this around the kitchen table.
Can you imagine doing this poll 6 months ago?
It's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and we have, well, 75% of the folks got it right, is IEPA. So the Emergency Powers Act, they deemed did not give the president the authority to do that. The government, of course, immediately appealed that, and we were just chatting off camera that that news should be out shortly. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that. So why don't we jump into the latest news? There's been, there's always news, but it has been a little quieter this last week. But there's always something to talk about, isn't there, gentlemen?
So
Patrick?
we like to refresh our slides, Craig, and reflect what's going on, what's in the news, what's happening. This one we keep up. Why? Because in less than a month from now, we're on the 10th of June today. So on the 9th of July, less than a month from now, remember this pause lifts. Liberation Day, Rose Garden, April the 2nd, the reciprocal tariffs were announced for 59 countries. We've got the main ones listed on the left-hand side, but there are many more, and we do have a full list of those in our collateral. So we're now less than a month away. I would have thought on Liberation Day, I would have thought by this point, so 2 months into the 90 days, we would have had some solid trade deals announced. We're now 30 days away from the expiry of that pause, and we're not hearing too much. So this is all gonna come to roost in a month's time. The numbers you see in the dark yellow boxes there are going to kick in. It's signed into law through an executive order. So we're going to see these come in unless there are some major trade deals and agreements done in the next 30 days or so. So,
well, I was going to say, I think it was Howard Lutnick said originally that it was going to be a trade deal a day because it was 90 days. So there's going to be a trade deal a day. I think, for any of you repeating, you'll know I'm based in Toronto, Canada. And up here, the news has been that there is a trade deal imminent with Canada, but obviously no news. The UK has done something. I think there's discussions ongoing right now with China as well. So I think there is some activity. It's just a question of, hey, maybe it's a question of it's a duck on the water, that looks serene on top, but there's all kinds of activity underneath. So we'll see what the truth is.
There is a theory that, countries aren't going to disclose where they are in their negotiations because it could give a competing country who has the same products or commodities, may give them an advantage when it's their turn to sit down with the White House and negotiate a deal. So there could be a lot of secrecy around what's being discussed, and we may get a flurry. We may get a flurry in the final week where everything's announced and everything becomes transparent.
Yeah, there's actually a question from Linda in the Q&A. She's asking, has there been any news about extending the pause? I haven't heard any news about extending the pause, although that is certainly a possibility. There's the other acronym that's sort of being bandied about in a kind of comedic way is the taco trade. So, meaning Trump always chickens out. So I don't know if that ends up being an extension or, it's imminently possible. I think any of the combinations, right? It's some trade deals being announced before the 90 days, and maybe they extend for certain countries that haven't had a chance at the plate yet. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. So why don't we roll on, Shane, to court rulings?
No, perfect. And I mean, guys, this is exactly what we're talking about now moving forward too with these recent court rulings, because we're looking at, okay, we have the July 9th date impending, but also on the side of this whole thing is the court ruling coming from the Court of International Trade. And if you've been following us over the past months, we had mentioned previously 12 states, a bunch of businesses were basically putting this lawsuit together, basically illustrating that the president doesn't have authority to extend kind of sweeping trade changes across with these IEEPA tariffs. So May 28th, the Court of International Trade in New York City made a ruling basically stating that the IEEPA tariffs exceed any authority granted to the president to regulate importation by means of tariffs. So that happened on the 28th. And just like we all know, within hours, things are constantly changing. So the following day, an appeal was filed with the Court of Appeals in the case that this needs to go to the Supreme Court. That stay was granted. So there was a temporary stay for 7 days. In parallel to this, the District Court of California and also the District Court of DC basically put in the motion saying that IEEPA also does not authorize tariff imposition, but they will reinforce this 14-day pause. So what does this mean right now? I mean, again, we're all waiting on this July 9th date, but to me, I feel like this is a kind of a bigger piece right now of we're coming on 2 weeks. What's actually going to happen with these tariffs and what's the ruling going to be? Because I just looked up the Supreme Court too. The Supreme Court's going to be going on recess by the end of this month and not until October. So there's a lot of speculation. If this does get punted to Supreme Court, Is this not going to get picked up until October? Would these tariffs still remain in effect with the IEEPA piece? So again, we're in this ongoing litigation piece. There's the core legal questions of, does IEEPA actually stick, and does the president have authority to do this? But back in my mind, it's all about the urgency for the importers. Again, this has been the whole point of this whiplash of what are they supposed to do? Now we're waiting around for additional timelines, rulings, etc. What I did find very interesting, I called this out last week, was on June 1st. It was, I think, Fox Sunday or so. The Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, said the tariffs, period, are not going away. The president has so many other authorities, quote unquote, the president has so many other authorities that even in a weird and unusual circumstance where these were taken away, we just bring on another and another. And it'll lead to a slide that we'll have coming up in two, is that there's other avenues at play here where they may be able to take these IEEPA tariffs in the case these things are shot down. So more to come here on this piece. I'll go through these other pieces and you'll see why this IEEPA has been such a highly sought controversy out there.
Yeah, I thought your note that the Supreme Court is on recess from the end of June until October is pretty interesting. But I don't know if they would have a special session if it was like that important. Who knows? But that is an interesting implication.
Yeah. So
where are we now? This is sort of the lay of the land now, as best we can kind of lay it out simply. For China, China's at 30% for the majority of their imports. However, the Section 301 tariffs are still in effect. And Section 301, we don't have time or space probably to do all the Section 301 tariffs. It's 25% roughly on $250 billion worth of goods, 7.5% on $120 billion of goods. But then there's all kinds of exceptions that for EVs and semiconductors and different types of goods that go all the way up to 100% and beyond. So those are still in full force and effect. Duty-free de minimis has ended for China and Hong Kong-based shipments. That started on May 2nd. And then the 301 tariff exclusions were extended for 164 different products, a lot of those being products that can't be produced in the United States. So there are carve-outs for 301 as well. 301 is getting pretty complicated. Canada and Mexico, that hasn't changed in a while. So USMCA compliant goods, so those are goods that are predominantly produced in Canada and Mexico, are at 0% tariff. Non-USMCA goods are at 25%. And then for Canada, there's a carve out for energy, again, because there's a need and not other sources of supply for the United States. For everybody else, or the general tariffs are at 25% for steel and aluminum. That increased to 50%. That was probably the biggest news item in the last week, was the increase in steel and aluminum. Tariffs, 25% on autos, 25% on oil and gas that's coming from Venezuela. Still not sure how they're figuring that out. And then the baseline tariff of 10% on all countries that is the base for anything other than these goods. And then, of course, the other big piece of news was the UK is at 10%. And that their steel and aluminum tariffs were being removed. So the UK is getting, I guess, the kid glove treatment compared to everybody else. From a reciprocal standpoint, China's got 10% on the majority of the US imports. I think the interesting thing is if you look at the 10% from China and the 30% that the US is charging, 20% of the 30 is the IEEPA tariffs or the fentanyl tariffs. So the U.S. has opened the door to China that if they fix the fentanyl issue, not sure how that gets, what the judgment is around fixing it, but that 20% could come off and you would end up at 10%. So a lot of this, if you read between the lines, it's feeling like 10%, guys, is kind of the number that they're falling on for most countries, and they've opened up a door to China for 10%. So that's interesting to me. And then, of course, Canada's retaliated with 25% tariffs on roughly $60 billion of goods. That hasn't changed either. So that's kind of where we sit right now as everything lays today. We'll see what happens next week. But I think the big news item was the steel and aluminum tariffs, which caught everyone by surprise.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So, Shane, why don't you break down some of these?
So again, I think when we all started this back in February, we never thought we'd be kind of going into the weeds here about the various trade measures that have been put out there in American history here. So just want to give everybody kind of high-level overview of what these separate ones are, primarily for the talk of purpose and process, and why IEEPA is really in the crosshairs here in terms of the Court of International Trade, other businesses. So Section 232, everybody's probably most aware of this one through the steel and aluminum piece. The purpose of this whole one is all about national security, making sure that the resources and goods that we're producing are not under some sort of international threat, and that, you know, domestically we can keep up, produce with these. But as that goes through a process, there is a formal investigation that goes on. It does go through the Department of Commerce. They basically investigate whether imports are, you know, there is a national threat there. And if there is a threat, the president can impose, obviously, additional tariffs on there. So as you now know, steel and aluminum are actually at 50% here. Section 301, a little bit different, but kind of in the same demeanor. The purpose here is really about unfair trade practices. So everybody should probably be most notable about this one was during Trump's first administration in 2018. Basically, concerns about intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, policies that are harming U.S. commerce. And again, these Section 301s were really started to be imposed by China during the first Trump administration. They continued all the way through the Biden administration. They're still currently in this version of the Trump administration. But the process there with those was it goes through U.S. trade representatives. They basically investigate if there's unfair trade practices, if there's violations found. Again, there's a process here. Now, in terms of the IEEPA one, why it's in this crosshairs is because basically it's stating that it's addressing a national emergency here. And the process really is nothing more than just the president declaring a national emergency. So it doesn't go through a formal investigation. It doesn't go through the Department of Commerce, U.S. trade representatives. There's no voting on this. And again, this is why it's such a hot topic with the Court of International Trade, as well as all these states and businesses, because it actually never went through any sort of process here. So that's really why there's kind of concern about this piece. But again, going back to Howard Lutnick's piece 2 Sundays ago, was really, if IEEPA somehow gets shot down here, those tariffs are most likely going to go through a Section 232, a Section 301, go through some formalized process. And if you think about it, everything currently is controlled by the Republicans right now. So it's a Republican-controlled House, Republican-controlled Senate. So they could easily fast-track a bill that basically classifies them under one of these other sections where there is some sort of formal process behind it. So again, I think it's very interesting on that piece. And I know, Nick, you said, I thought a court injunction was due June 9th. We haven't heard anything hide nor hair. It's actually surprising how little news has actually been reported on where this currently sits at. We do know that when the court injunction, or when the appeals came into play on the 29th, their enforcement was the rulings by an additional 14 days. So again, we're all kind of waiting. I feel as though we should be hearing something by the end of this week, because we are going on the 2-week mark. And also, again, with the Supreme Court going to be heading out on recess soon. But this is one that we should all be really tracking carefully here.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what happens, and what happens if they put them into 232 or 301. Yeah, it's always interesting. So the other, piece of news that we touched on earlier is the end of de minimis exemptions, but this is a really big deal. So most of the goods, or a ton of the goods coming from China and Hong Kong, were coming under de minimis. So think about companies like Shein and Temu. where anything under $800 was treated as duty free. That's ceased now since May 2nd. So we've been going on a month now. Anything under $800 is subject to all applicable duties. Remember that was well over 100% for a while. It's since dropped to $800. It's, 54% of value, or $100 per package for postal shipments. And then the other interesting issue is, beforehand, there wasn't a lot of reporting requirements. So HS codes and all those things were not required in order to import. That is required now. So, it's a lot more like a formal entry coming into the United States under $800, even for something as simple as, a $50 or $75 tchotchke is going to come in and require an HS code. Is going to require entry, be done, the way any other entry is done. So that's interesting. The other interesting thing is the One Big Beautiful Bill includes a provision that it eliminates de minimis entirely for all countries by June 1st, 2027. So we'll see if that makes it all the way through. Well, it's assuming the bill makes it through, or if that gets changed, but I doubt it, because that's a bipartisan, I think removing de minimis was a bipartisan initiative in the first place. So I doubt that's going to get changed. So, that's a big change for the industry.
Yeah, and Craig, it's funny, we keep seeing more of these bipartisan bills continue to hit. Another one was just laid out on the floor 2 weeks ago, the closing of the De Minimis Loophole Act. Again, bipartisan piece. So outside of even this Big Beautiful Bill Act, there are, I think, 3 other ones currently out there on removal of de minimis.
So it's going to happen. It's just a question of when, right?
Yeah.
And let's not forget, this is goods which have an origin of China and Hong Kong, regardless of where they get resold through. So Craig mentioned earlier on, we were in Australia just last week, and we spoke to countless merchants, retailers, marketplaces based in Australia, making a living out of their business in Australia. But guess where their goods were from? Guess where they were going? They were from China. They were going to the US. So all of a sudden, that $800 is impacting the economy of Australia. So it's at the moment, it's just a made in China, made in Hong Kong goods. But if they're going via another country, it doesn't matter. It is still subject to this elimination of de minimis.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of misconceptions about that. That's, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is true. As Patrick said, we had merchants come up to us and say, well, we're shipping from Australia, so it doesn't really matter that it's made in China. And, we hated to be the bearers of bad news, but that is not true. It matters where the good was produced. And that's a good segue, actually. We consider de minimis one of the 4 big puzzle pieces of global trade that everyone who is moving goods across borders should be aware of. Number 1 to me, which is number 3 on this list, is tariff code classification, or what are commonly known as HS codes. To me, that's the Rosetta Stone of global trade. It's really the key that unlocks everything. And hopefully, if you're on this call, you likely know what an HS code is, but in case you don't, it's every country has up to 6 digits. It's consistent across countries, but then typically countries are going to add 3 to 6 digits, usually 4. So it's a 10-digit code that describes the good in gory amounts of detail. Those codes need to be correct, because they are what determine the rules for that good. And that brings into play the other important component, which is country of origin. So you need to know the country of origin, or where the good was produced. The reason that's important is because the intersection of those 2 things. So if you think of a table like an Excel sheet, the rows are the HS codes, or the tariff codes, and the columns are the country of origin. And the cells where they intersect are the duty rates that are charged. So if you have a country of origin of China, and your HS code is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the intersection of those 2 is what determines what your duty rate is going to be for that particular good. depending on the country you're importing it to. And the last piece of it that determines how much you're going to pay is the declared value. And this is a really important one as well, because, you know, I've seen things on LinkedIn where folks are monkeying with the declared value and sort of taking liberty with it to try to lower their overall duty impact. Do not do that. The CBP is very aware of that. They're looking out for it, and you will be penalized if you try to play with the declared values or play with any of these things. As a matter of fact, we just mentioned country of origin being another one. So these are the important elements. De minimis exemptions. Each country has a different version of that. The dollar value that duty starts to be paid. Country of origin, tariff code classification, and declared value. Those are all things that are very, very, very important for your global trade business. All right, let's continue. Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just going to move us onto to a new slide, a fresh slide. We've got some fresh data. So what does this show? Well, this is the U.S. trade deficit for goods. So remember what a trade deficit is. It's the difference between what, as a country, what you import, what you consume from overseas versus what you export to overseas markets. So, you know, traditionally the U.S. has ran at a negative. That's not a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing either. It just means that the U.S. consumes a lot. It consumes a lot from overseas. We know that. It's around us. It's in our offices. It's in our warehouses. It's in our homes. But what is interesting is that April, the data that we have here, the trade deficit dropped to just over 60 billion. You can see for the last few quarters, it was riding high over 100 billion, and the drop down to just 61.6 billion is primarily driven by the decline in imports. That is not a surprise, okay? We've seen that decline. We've talked about shipping containers. We've talked about capacity in air and on sea reducing. The Port of Long Beach, just around the corner from where I am, has had a shrinking activity. So we knew that drop was coming, but this is where we stand now in the trade deficit, still negative. We still import more than we export out of the country. But this is the biggest drop going back till, well, almost 30 years.
Yeah, Patrick, I mean, this one was astonishing. I mean, and we talk about tariff and trade whiplash from the beginning. There's nothing more representative than this chart that illustrates the whiplash here. I mean, you can see that everybody at the beginning of this year, when the tariff talks were happening, they were trying to import as much as humanly possible here. Clearly, once the April, 145% tariffs went into play with China, you could see that volume just completely plummeted across the board here. And if you go a little bit deeper on that 16% drop, I mean, 32 consumer goods and imports, which is a major part of that, dropped 32%. Industrial supplies, automotive parts, etc. So this is really astonishing. And already they're trying to get some ideas on what it's going to look like in May. And I wouldn't be surprised if May is going to be similar. Already it's come out that the May data as of Chinese shipments to the U.S. sank 35% year over year in May. So again, talking about the supply demand, how that correlates with that 145%. Then also the other stat that it takes 22 days from a transatlantic shipment from Shanghai to LA as being part of this whole piece. I mean, this is pretty astonishing that this is the largest drop ever recorded since they started doing this back in 1992. So this is, again, I then wouldn't be surprised then if we see the June numbers here spike up again, because think about it, the timeline, removing the 145% tariff on China down to 30%, I'm sure we're then going to see again this kind of whiplash.
It's amazing. It's history unfolding in front of our eyes. And, economists in 100 years, they'll look back at this and what happened, and we're living it. We're living it and we're reacting to it. So I think you're right. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about cards and who's holding cards as this plays out in front of our eyes. I think we all know, we've all heard, one of the biggest cards is the rare earths. So rare earth minerals, metals. China has a stranglehold on these particular rare earth minerals, which go into a lot of high technology products that we're using now and that we expect to use in the future. So the US, if you remember, the US imposed a tariff, 25%, imposed a tariff effective the 1st of January 2026 on these rare earth minerals. In the same instance, the delegation from the US were trying to get commitments from China to resume and increase the supply of rare earths. So this is going to become very, very topical over the coming months, because the counter move by China, if you recall, was to put export controls. Every country has a right to put export controls on products that it manufactures or mines or smelts. It has that right, and China exercised that right. But that's going to disrupt. It's going to disrupt the supply chain of these high-tech electronic products, which it goes into. And we're seeing firms, as a result, to Shane's earlier point, we're seeing firms ramp up the import of these products during this lull, this quiet period, this pause that we've got, to make sure that they can produce what they need to produce for the foreseeable future. So keep an eye on this. We're going to keep an eye on it as well, because we believe it's going to play a significant part in how all this ends up shaking out in terms of the relationship between China and the US.
Right. It's all about leverage, right?
Yeah. And then another one. So we speak to customers all the time. We speak to customers, we speak to partners all over the world, not just here in the US. And what are we seeing? So we've bucketed this first and foremost, and I think we are all feeling this because it's happening right now, is the rising costs and the price hikes. So products are coming into the country. The baseline 10% is there. Then additional tariffs are being added on top of that. We know the pause is coming off on reciprocals in less than a month. So we're already seeing, particularly because of the steel and aluminium, which is in everything, right? We're already seeing the prices go up. So as a consequence, there's cost pressures. There's cost pressures, and it's meaning that executives are having to sit around a table and look at their supply chains. They're realizing their costs are going up. The invoices are flying in, and they can see they're going up. So what are they having to do? Well, they're having to tariff engineer. We spoke about this. We've always spoken about this. Tariff engineering. They look at where they're sourcing that product, that commodity, that widget. Can I get it from another country? Can I legally avoid paying a higher duty? So that is happening a lot. We know that. We speak to customers, and we know that they're looking at different supply chains where they can source it from. So should that fail and the invoices are still piling up, the higher cost invoices, then they're looking at layoffs and restructuring. Of course, companies are here to survive. They can only survive if they're profitable. And if you can't do anything about your cost base of your commodities and the widgets and the materials and so on and so forth that you need for your goods, then you have to look at other cost lines. Labor is one of those cost lines. So that's happening. We're seeing restructuring and layoffs. And then finally, CFOs, they're reporting tighter margins. I think Shane's got a few examples in the next slide where companies are on earnings calls are reporting tighter margins, reduced profitability because these costs are going up. They're going up. They can't get the revenue fast enough to make up for the costs. So we're seeing that being reported in earnings calls as the.
Yeah, and it's a good segue, Patrick, here. Sorry about the delay. No, it's a good segue here. I mean, because again, week over week, we're continuing to see on these earnings calls new things happening. So, PVH that does Calvin Klein estimating $65 million drop in relation to due to tariffs. Volvo, the 3,000 jobs being cut. Lululemon, if anybody was following last Friday, wow, 20% decrease in Lululemon's stock after they reported their lower earnings just because of the trade war and pullback in consumers' sentiment on that piece. And then again, going back to that whole chart on the trade whiplash of last week I had mentioned the stat that container ships from Shanghai to LA were up 17% week over week from a cost perspective. This past week, just reported yesterday, it's up 58%. If you put from the prior week, so now it's at around $5,200 from Shanghai to LA. If you look at that figure from the beginning of this year, more than double, $5,100 or $5,200 versus $2,000 back in January. So again, we are continuing to see this up and down approach based upon what is everybody doing on a supply, demand, timing perspective.
Yeah, so what do you do about it, right? There's 5 proactive steps that we've talked to customers about and that have been relayed to us, different conversations with suppliers and customers. There's a number of things you can do. So you can look at diversifying your shipping carriers or sources of supply. That's one approach you can take. Automating your trade compliance, that's something we can obviously help you with. We'll talk a bit more about that. You can work with your customs broker to lean on their expertise and their network, although the caution would be that those folks are awfully busy right now, so they may not have as much time as they otherwise would. Fourth is, back to the 4 kind of key components of global trade. Make sure your product details are compliant with global trade regulations, so that your country of origin, your HS codes, your declared values are correct, especially those things are important. And the other thing that a lot of companies that we've talked to are doing, which is a short-term fix but has worked, is to build inventory to absorb some of those short-term headwinds. So a lot of companies that were previously just in time are now rethinking that because it may be a little more risky as all these trade issues and headwinds unfold. Maybe it makes more sense to hold a little more inventory, even if that is more expensive in the short term. In the long term, it may pay dividends. All right, let's go on to a poll question. So how are you planning to adjust your supply chain to accommodate for all of these changes? You can read all the different selections. I'll take it to the actual poll question. A reminder here that you can choose multiple things. So if you're doing all of these things, you can select all of them. You can select one of them. That is entirely up to you. But we're tracking these things to kind of understand how folks are responding to these trade headwinds, what they're doing, what they're thinking, is very interesting. So if you could take a moment to answer that, that would be great. And we'll show you the results here. All right, let's flip over. Diversification is number one. That's interesting. So switching to local suppliers and diversifying suppliers, if you take those two together, that is the vast majority of what everyone's thinking about. So that's really interesting. The other big issue is I don't know, because I don't know what's going to happen, I think is probably the answer to that. So thanks, folks, for the input. Another question for you: how are you going to address the costs of these global tariffs? Are you going to pass it on, tariff surcharge, absorb it? Do you have other plans? Again, you can select multiple of these choices. So I'll give you a moment to respond to that. We actually track this one, and we'll show you in a moment the results historically. We just like to see how it's evolving over time. We've seen some interesting kind of spikes from time to time, but see how consistent it is with previous weeks. I forget which week we're on. Are we on 18? It's been, we've been doing this for a while. All right. So yeah, passing on additional costs, including a tariff surcharge. That's interesting. A little higher on absorbing the costs than I think it has traditionally been. That's maybe because folks are starting to understand what the true cost implications are, or because the tariffs have come down a little bit, right, from China. So maybe that's driving that. So you see that last one of absorbing the costs is higher than it historically has been, but passing on the additional charges is still the vast majority of what folks are planning to do. So that continues to be an interesting outcome, I think, and it'll sort of play into what happens with inflation and economic turbulence going forward. All right. So how can a business keep up with these changes, folks?
Well,
Yeah,
hey,
well, yeah, I think we always touch on this. You're not alone, okay? 55% of our respondents are facing this challenge, at least, okay? That number's rising. So how can you keep up with the changes? It's all about compliance. Craig mentioned the 4 horsemen earlier on, if you remember. Make sure you're compliant with all those 4 horsemen, okay? If not, there's going to be penalties, there's going to be fines, and there's going to be delays because of non-compliance. It's a sovereign country, it's a government, it has a right to defend its borders, and when products come in, the government has a right to inspect, to challenge, to inquire, and you've got to be compliant with the law. It's as simple as that. Do not overcharge on customs duty. Undercharging means you're out of pocket, not great. And overcharging, well, then you're not competitive, okay? You've got to be you've absolutely to the penny, you've got to be right on your duties, and there's calculation tools available for that. And then you're going to get added supply costs. If you're not compliant, you're going to have to rush things. You're going to have to deal with returns. You're going to have to deal with abandoned shipments. You're going to have to deal with supplier negotiations. These are all added costs which you don't need, and they're going to eat into your margin. So compliance, compliance, compliance.
All right. Well, why don't we talk? We're running out of time here, so we're going to try to maybe speed up a little bit. We want to talk about how you can maintain compliance with Avalara. We have a number of trade solutions, calculating duties and taxes, figuring out your tariff codes, understanding what your restrictions are. We have a whole bunch of different ways you can do that, different formats. However, we did want to highlight and show a demo of one of those tools, which is a self-serve classification tool. So we're going to run a video here, and we're actually going to offer you a free demo of that tool.
Welcome to the Avalara Tariff Content Classification Tool demo. Click to learn how this tool can accurately classify your products. First, choose the country of import. In our example, we will use the US. Click to proceed. Next, select the country of origin. In our example, we will use China. Click to proceed. Next, let's describe our product. Click to proceed. Now, we are ready to classify. Click to proceed. The tariff classification tool needs to know a few more details. Click to select the upper material. Select the lower material. Click to proceed. We've now reached an HS. Click to drill down to reach the HS10. Since our product is a men's golf shoe, click to drill down. Since our product is not welt footwear, click to drill down. We have reached the HS8. Click to find the HS10. We have now reached our HS10. Click to see rate description. Here we can see the total duty amount for this product. This totals 28.5% general rate plus 125% punitive rate, which equals 153.5%. This concludes the demo.
Fantastic. And as part of this whole piece, we hope individuals that have been joining these calls are taking place in our
Welcome
trials.
to the Avalara Tariff Content Classification Tool demo.
Let's see here. All right. Well, we are offering a 14-day free trial of this tool. So we're just going to go on to the next slide just because the piece is here. If you do select and raise your hand, we will get back to you by the end of this week with your own personal login information, password to trial this for 14 days, a limited amount of transactions across, I believe, 3 or 4 markets. For those of you that are currently doing this now and have any questions with it, do not hesitate to reach out to the individual that sent you those login credentials. We'd be more than happy to jump on a call, walk you through it, answer any questions. And as always, we'd always love to talk to you if you have additional questions around global trade compliance. So if there's any hand raisers currently out there now that have questions around everything we've been talking about today, how to be more compliant, how to be proactive, what's happening, please select yes here. We will reach out to you as soon as possible on this front. In relation to question and answer, I think we're actually pretty good here in terms of, I know the team's been answering behind the scenes. I will do a shameless plug here. You know, Regina mentioned that we're doing this whole Crush event on tour. I will be in Chicago on June 18th. Again, free event. One of the spotlights is going to be on cross-border. And then we'll also be doing another one on June 26th. New York City. George, who's manning questions behind the booth right now, will also be there. So we'd love to meet in person. It's a free event. It should be absolutely fantastic. So we'd love to see you there. And as always, we have a plethora of resources that are constantly being updated through our cross-border pages and webinars.
Right.
Excellent.
Regina, anything else you want to call out?
Yeah, just some upcoming webinars to keep in mind. Some of that are pertinent here. HS Codes 101 is on Thursday. And then just a note, we are not having a trade and tariff webinar at the beginning of July. And the 7/10, July 10th webinar is actually Thursday to accommodate all of the announcements that'll be happening on the 9th. And just to close us out here, we'll be sending out a post-event email later today with a link back to the console where you can access the recording, the slide deck, additional resources. We hope you can join us again next week as we continue our weekly webinar series. And that post-event email will also have instructions on how to register for upcoming sessions. Thanks so much for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.